The winter wind cut across the Wyoming plains like a blade, carrying with it the promise of the worst blizzard the territory had seen in a decade. John Stewart pulled his collar up against the bitter cold as he made his way across the frozen ground toward the north pasture, where the ranch hands had reported seeing something that made his blood run cold. The year was 1907, and the Broken Arrow Ranch stretched across 15,000 acres of some of the most unforgiving land in Wyoming. John had worked here for 5 years, earning a reputation as the best horse handler in 3 counties. Men twice his age sought his advice on breaking stubborn colts, and even the wildest mustangs seemed to calm under his steady hands. But none of that mattered to Foreman Dalton Reed, the man who ran Broken Arrow with an iron fist and a heart to match. John found the scene exactly as the hands had described. A young stallion, perhaps 3 years old, had fallen through the ice of a half-frozen creek. The animal was trapped, its powerful body wedged between chunks of ice, one rear leg bent at an angle that made John's stomach turn. The horse's dark coat was soaked through, its breath coming in visible clouds of steam that grew weaker with each passing moment. "There you are, Stewart," Dalton's voice boomed across the pasture. The foreman sat astride his own mount, surrounded by half a dozen ranch hands who looked anywhere but at the suffering animal. "I was about to send someone to fetch you, though I don't know why I bothered." John knelt at the creek's edge, assessing the situation. The stallion's eyes found his, and in that gaze, John saw not just pain, but a fierce will to survive. This was no ordinary rancher. Something about the animal's bearing, even in its desperate state, spoke of exceptional bloodlines and uncommon spirit. "We can get him out," John said, already formulating a plan. "If we use ropes and approach from both sides, distribute his weight." "We're not doing anything," Dalton interrupted, his voice flat. "That horse is finished. Broken leg, half frozen, probably damaged internally from the fall. Even if we pulled him out, he'd never work again. I'm not wasting time, manpower, or veterinary fees on an animal with no future." John's jaw tightened. "He doesn't have a broken leg. It's twisted, maybe dislocated, but I've seen worse injuries. Heal completely. Give me 2 hours and some rope." "Did I stutter, Stewart?" Tom's face reamed despite the cold. "That animal is a loss. We'll put it down humanely once the veterinarian arrives this afternoon. Until then, it stays where it is. I've got paying work for these men, and you're going to help drive the herd to the southern range, like you were supposed to be doing an hour ago." The other ranch hands shifted uncomfortably in their saddles. They all knew John's reputation with horses, and several of them had seen him work miracles with animals others had given up on. But Dalton Reed's word was law on Broken Arrow, and crossing him meant losing your job in a territory where work was scarce and winters were deadly. John stood slowly, his decision already made. "I'm not leaving him." The wind seemed to hold its breath. Dalton's eyes narrowed to slits. "What did you just say?" "I said, I'm not leaving him to die in this creek while we argue about whether he's worth saving." John's voice was steady, though his heart hammered against his ribs. "I'll do it on my own time. You can dock my pay for the hours, but I'm getting this horse out." Dalton dismounted with deliberate slowness, his boots crunching on the frozen ground as he approached. He was a big man, thick through the shoulders from years of ranch work, and he used his size to intimidate. But John held his ground. "You've been trouble since the day you arrived here, Stewart," Dalton said, his breath reeking of tobacco. "Always thinking you know better than everyone else. Always acting like these animals are something more than tools for working this land. Well, I'm done with your insubordination." "Then fire me," John replied quietly. "But I'm still getting this horse out of the creek." "Oh, I'm going to do better than fire you." Dalton's smile was cruel. "I'm going to make sure every ranch from here to Montana knows you're unreliable, disobedient, soft. By the time I'm done, you won't find work shoveling stables, let alone handling horses." The foreman turned to the assembled ranch hands. "Anyone who helps Stewart with that animal is fired. Alongside him, anyone who even stays to watch can join them both. Now get back to work, all of you." One by one, the men turned their horses away. A few cast apologetic glances at John, but none of them spoke up. They had families to feed, and Dalton's threat wasn't empty. In this part of Wyoming, his word could indeed blacklist a man for life. Within minutes, John stood alone beside the creek, the trapped stallion, and Foreman. "Dalton, you've got until I ride back to the main house to pack your things and get off this property." Dalton said, "That's 10 minutes, Stewart. If you're still here when I return with the owner, I'll have you arrested for trespassing. He mounted his horse and rode away, leaving John in the howling wind with a dying animal and a choice that would change everything. John didn't hesitate. The moment Dalton disappeared over the rise, he was moving. He grabbed rope from his saddle, tied one end around a sturdy cottonwood tree, and waded into the freezing water. The cold hit him like a physical blow, stealing his breath, but he pushed forward until he reached the stallion. Easy now, he murmured, his hands finding the animal's neck. I know it hurts, but we're going to get you out of here. The horse's eyes met his again, and John could have sworn he saw understanding there. He worked quickly, knowing he had only minutes before hypothermia became a threat to them both. He looped the rope around the stallion's chest, being careful to avoid the injured leg, then positioned himself to push while the rope pulled. On 3, he told the horse, as if the animal could understand. 1, 2, 3. John heaved with everything he had. The stallion seemed to sense what was needed and pushed with its front legs, its powerful muscles straining. Despite its weakened condition, ice cracked and shifted. For a terrible moment John thought they were both going to go under, but then something gave way, and the horse surged forward onto solid ground. They both lay there, panting and soaked through as the wind tore across the pasture. John knew he should run, should get to the bunk house, grab his things, and leave before Dalton returned with reinforcements. But he couldn't abandon the stallion now. He managed to get the horse into the shelter of an old equipment shed at the pasture's edge. Using his own coat and every piece of dry cloth he could find, John rubbed the animal down, trying to restore circulation and warmth. The injured leg needed attention, but at least the horse was out of the water and out of the wind. I have to go, John said finally, his own teeth chattering from the cold. But I'll try to send someone back. Try to send help somehow. The stallion whinnied softly, a sound that seemed to carry both gratitude and protest. As John stumbled away toward the bunkhouse, he looked back once. The horse was standing now, favoring its injured leg, but very much alive, watching him with those intelligent dark eyes. John made it to the bunkhouse just as Dalton returned with the ranch owner, a wealthy cattle baron named Ezekiel Thornton. Thornton was a hard man who'd built his empire through ruthless business practices, but he was also pragmatic. If an employee was valuable enough, he might override his foreman's decisions. But as John gathered his few possessions, a change of clothes, his father's pocket knife, a battered Bible, he could hear Dalton's voice carrying across the yard, poisoning any chance of appeal. Completely insubordinate, wasted valuable time, can't be trusted to follow orders, bad influence on the other men. John slung his pack over his shoulder and walked out into the gathering storm. Thornton stood on the porch of the main house, his expression unreadable as John passed. The old man said nothing, offered nothing, and John didn't expect him to. This was Dalton's ranch to run, and Thornton rarely interfered with his foreman's decisions about personnel. As John walked through the ranch gate for the last time, the first heavy snowflakes began to fall. He had no horse. His mount belonged to the ranch, and the nearest town was 20 miles south. The storm was intensifying, and night would fall in less than 3 hours. He thought about the stallion in the equipment shed. Would anyone even remember to check on it? Would Dalton follow through on his plan to have the animal put down? Or would he simply let nature take its course during the blizzard? John pushed those thoughts aside and started walking. He'd done what he could. The rest was beyond his control. He made it perhaps 5 miles before the blizzard hit in earnest. Visibility dropped to mere feet and the temperature plummeted. John found shelter in a rocky outcropping, using his pack as a pillow and his coat as a blanket, knowing it was inadequate but having no other choice. As he huddled against the stone, watching snow pile up at the entrance to his makeshift cave, John wondered if this was how it would end. Frozen to death on the Wyoming plains because he'd chosen to save a horse's life instead of following orders. But as darkness fell and the wind howled like a living thing, John heard something that made no sense. Through the chaos of the storm, clear and strong, came the sound of a horse's call. Not the frightened cry of an animal lost in the blizzard, but something else entirely. A call of determination, of purpose, of something that sounded almost like rage. John sat up, straining to hear over the wind. There it was again, closer now, and this time he recognized it. It was the stallion. The horse appeared at the entrance to John's shelter like an apparition from a fever dream. Snow covered its dark coat, but the animal was moving with strength that should have been impossible. The injured leg bore weight now, not perfectly, but well enough to have carried the horse 5 m through a blizzard. How? John breathed, unable to finish the question. The stallion shook its head, sending snow flying, then stepped into the shelter and lowered itself to the ground beside John. The animal's body heat was like a furnace, and John found himself instinctively pressing closer, seeking warmth that might mean the difference between life and death. You should be at the ranch, John said, though he was grateful beyond words for the company and the warmth. That leg, you shouldn't be able to walk, let alone track me through a blizzard. The horse turned its head to look at him, and in the dimness of the rocky shelter, John saw something in those eyes that defied explanation. Intelligence, yes, but something more. Purpose, decision. Almost as if the animal had made a calculated choice to leave safety and follow the man who'd saved its life. They weathered the storm together. Man and horse huddled in the rocky outcropping while the blizzard raged. Outside, John drifted in and out of consciousness, unsure what was real and what was hypothermia-induced hallucination. At some point, he thought he heard other horses calling in the distance, their voices carrying across the windswept plains, but that was impossible. No horse would be out in this storm by choice. When John woke, the storm had passed. Dawn light filtered into the shelter, revealing a landscape transformed by snow, and standing at the entrance, silhouetted against the pale sky, was the stallion. But the horse wasn't alone. John blinked, certain he was still dreaming. Ranged across the snowy landscape were horses, not just a few strays separated from their herds, but dozens of them, perhaps more. They stood in loose formation, their breath creating clouds of mist in the cold morning air, all facing toward the rocky outcropping where John had taken shelter. What in God's name? John crawled out of the shelter, his joints stiff from cold and his clothes still damp. The stallion moved aside to let him pass, then positioned itself next to him as if presenting him to the assembled herd. John recognized some of the horses. That paint mare belonged to the Riverside Ranch 15 miles east. The big bay gelding was from the settlement at Wolf Creek. The gray with a distinctive blaze had to be from the Winston spread 20 m north. These animals had come from all over the territory, traveling through a blizzard that should have sent them running for their home stables. As John stood there, trying to make sense of what he was seeing, more horses appeared. They came over the rises and out of the valleys, emerging from the snow-covered landscape like soldiers answering a call to arms. Within an hour, John counted over 100 animals, and they kept coming. The stallion he'd saved began to move, and the other horses parted to create a path. The animal walked a few paces, then stopped and looked back at John. The message clear. Follow me. Where are we going? John asked, feeling foolish for talking to a horse but needing to voice the question aloud. The stallion couldn't answer, but turned and began walking with purpose across the snowy plains, and the massive herd fell in behind it with John at the center of the procession. It took John several miles to realize where they were headed. The stallion was leading them back to the Broken Arrow Ranch. No, John said, stopping in his tracks. I can't go back there. Dalton will have me arrested. Thornton made it clear, I'm not welcome. But the horses around him didn't stop. They flowed past him like a river around a stone, their movement gentle but insisting. The stallion circled back and nudged John's shoulder with its muzzle, pushing him forward. John tried to turn away to break free from the herd and head toward town, but the horses firmly prevented him. They were taking him back to Broken Arrow, whether he wanted to go or not. As they crested the final rise before the ranch came into view, John's breath caught in his throat. The ranch was in chaos. Horses that should have been in corral or stables were running loose, and he could see ranch hands scrambling to restore order. Dalton stood in the center of the mayhem, shouting orders that no one seemed able to follow. But what made John's blood run cold was the sight of smoke rising from the main stable. Not the thick black smoke of a structure fire, but the gray haze of smoldering hay. A fire had started and been put out, but the damage was clear even from a distance. The stallion let out a cry that echoed across the valley, and every horse on the ranch stopped what it was doing. The animals that had been running wild turned toward the sound. The horses in the remaining intact corral began calling back, and the massive herd that surrounded John began to descend toward the ranch like an avalanche of flesh and spirit. Dalton saw them coming. John watched the foreman's face cycle through confusion, disbelief, and finally fear as he took in the impossible sight. 200 horses, maybe more, moving in perfect formation with the man he'd fired and threatened just yesterday walking in their midst. Ranch hands scattered, seeking shelter in buildings and behind fences, but Thornton stood his ground on the porch of the main house, his weathered face betraying no emotion. As the herd approached, the stallion led John directly to the center of the ranch yard, then stopped. The other horses formed a massive circle around them, cutting off all escape routes. John found found himself facing Dalton and Thornton, with an army of animals at his back. "What devil's work is this?" Dalton's voice shook. His usual bravado evaporated. "Stuart, what have you done?" "I didn't do anything," John replied honestly. "I saved one horse. Everything else, I can't explain it." Thornton descended the porch, stepped slowly, his eyes moving from John to the stallion to the assembled herd. He was a man who'd spent his entire life working with livestock, who prided himself on understanding animal behavior. What he was seeing defied everything he knew. "That's the horse from the creek," Thornton said, pointing at the stallion. "Dalton told me you'd wasted time trying to save a worthless animal with a broken leg." "His leg was dislocated, not broken," John said, "and I wouldn't call him worthless." As if to prove the point, the stallion stepped forward. The animal moved with only the slightest hitch in its gait, the injured leg bearing weight that should have been impossible less than 24 hours after such severe trauma. The horse walked directly up to Thornton and stopped, fixing the ranch owner with an unwavering stare. Thornton reached out cautiously and ran his hand along the stallion's neck, checking its condition with the practiced eye of a man who'd evaluated thousands of horses. His expression grew more troubled with each passing moment. "This animal should be dead or crippled," Thornton said finally. "The injury Dalton described, there's no way it could have healed this fast. And yet, here it stands, having apparently led every horse in 3 counties to my doorstep." He turned to his foreman. "Dalton, explain to me exactly what happened yesterday." The foreman's face re-eamed. "Like I said, sir, the horse fell through the ice. It was finished, not worth the effort to save. Stuart defied my direct order. And show me the leg you said was broken." Thorne interrupted. Dalton hesitated, then pointed to the stallion's rear right leg. It was bent at an unnatural angle, clearly fractured. Any fool could see, any fool, except a man who's worked with horses his entire life. Thornton's voice had gone dangerously quiet. "Because I'm looking at a horse that should be dead, but instead appears to have orchestrated something I've never seen in 40 years of ranching. Either John Stuart is some kind of miracle worker, or you severely misjudged this animal's condition." Before Dalton could respond, a new commotion drew everyone's attention. Riders were approaching from multiple directions, ranch owners in their hands, all looking for missing horses. John recognized several men from neighboring spreads, their faces showing the same mixture of confusion and awe that he'd felt upon seeing the gathered herd. A stocky man named Douglas from the Riverside Ranch was the first to speak. "Thornton, what in blazes is going on here? Half my horses went missing during the storm. Followed their tracks straight to your property." "Same here," called out a lean man John knew as Carlson from Wolf Creek. "Lost 14 head. All of them ended up here, apparently of their own accord." More voices joined in, each telling the same impossible story. Horses had left their stables and corrals during or immediately after the blizzard, traveling miles through dangerous conditions to converge on the Broken Arrow Ranch. Thornton raised his hands for silence. "Gentlemen, I'm as baffled as you are, but before we discuss the logistics of returning your animals, I need you all to witness something." He turned to John. "Stuart, tell them what happened yesterday." John recounted the story, keeping his voice level and factual. He described finding the stallion, Dalton's order to leave it, his decision to save the animal anyway, and his subsequent firing. He explained how the horse had found him during the storm, and how he'd woken to find an impossible gathering of animals. "That's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard," Dalton sputtered. "Horses don't organize rescue missions. This man clearly used some method to lure these animals away from their rightful owners." The stallion cut him off with a sound that made every human present fall silent. It wasn't a simple neigh or whinny, but something deeper, more complex. The horse's call rose and fell, with patterns that seemed almost like speech, and other horses in the herd began to respond, their voices joining in a chorus that sent chills down John's spine. "My word," whispered Carlson. "Are they communicating?" The chorus grew louder, more intense. John could feel the sound reverberating in his chest, sense meaning in the patterns, even though he couldn't understand the language. The horses were telling a story, he realized, a story of neglect, of animals worked until they broke and then discarded, a story of the rare human who showed mercy when it wasn't convenient or profitable, a story of loyalty repaid in the only way they knew how. When the chorus finally faded, leaving only the wind and the sound of nervous human breathing, Thornton's face had gone pale. "Dalton," the ranch owner said quietly, "how many horses have we lost this year?" The foreman shifted uncomfortably. "Lost, sir, injured, beyond recovery, put down, sold for meat, abandoned when they couldn't work anymore." "How many?" "I don't keep exact figures on animals that are no longer productive, sir. Perhaps 20, 25, no more than average for an operation this size." "I see." Thornton walked slowly around the assembled herd, his expression growing more troubled. world. And in 40 years of ranching, I've never seen anything like this. Horses from dozens of different ranches, different owners, different treatment. And yet, they all came here. They all followed the one man on my property who defied orders to save an animal you deemed worthless. He stopped in front of John. Mr. Stewart, I owe you an apology and possibly much more than that. Mr. Thornton, with respect, Dalton interjected desperately. You can't seriously be taking the side of an insubordinate employee over your foreman based on some kind of mass delusion about horse behavior. Be quiet, Dalton. Thornton didn't raise his voice, but the command carried absolute authority. You've been my foreman for 6 years, and in that time, our horse operation has become increasingly costly. Animals injured more frequently, broken in spirit, dying young. I attributed it to hard work and bad luck, but now I'm wondering if it was something else entirely. Douglas from Riverside Ranch spoke up. Thornton, that paint mare of mine that's in your herd, she's never left our property in her life. Gentle as a kitten trained by my daughter. For her to travel 15 miles in a blizzard to be here, something extraordinary must have happened. My horses, too, added Carlson. These aren't flighty young colts. These are stable, well-trained animals that made a choice to come here. And I'm starting to think I know why. The other ranch owners began to murmur agreement. They were hard, practical men who dealt in the realities of ranching life. But what they were witnessing challenged everything they thought they knew about the animals that formed the foundation of their livelihoods. Dalton's face had gone from red to white. He could see his authority crumbling, see the shift in how the other men were looking at him. In a last desperate attempt to regain control, he reached for the rifle strapped to his saddle. This is all superstitious nonsense, he declared, his voice shaking. These are just animals, nothing more, and I'll prove it right now by putting down that stallion, like I should have done yesterday. He brought the rifle to his shoulder, aiming at the horse that stood calmly beside John. But before he could fire, something extraordinary happened. The massive herd moved as one. 200 horses surged forward, not in panic or chaos, but with coordinated purpose. They formed a living wall between Dalton and his target, their bodies creating an impenetrable barrier. The stallion remained perfectly still, showing no fear, as if it understood that its army had come to answer the threat. Dalton's hand shook so badly that he lowered the rifle. The fear in his eyes was primal, the look of a man confronted with forces beyond his comprehension or control. That's enough, Thornton said, his voice cutting through the tension. Dalton, you're fired. Effective. Immediately. Get your things and be off my property within the hour. Sir, you can't after everything I've done for this ranch. What you've done, Thornton interrupted, is build an operation based on treating living creatures as disposable tools. You nearly cost me the finest horse I've ever seen. And based on what I'm witnessing here, you've created conditions so poor that animals from across the territory felt compelled to gather in protest. He turned to John. Mr. Stewart, I'd like to offer you a position not just as a horse handler, but as foreman, complete authority over the care and treatment of every animal on this ranch, housing, full salary, and profit sharing. If you can turn our horse operation around. John looked at the stallion beside him, at the massive herd still standing in protective formation, at the other ranch owners watching with a mixture of awe and respect. He thought about everything that had happened in the past day, how a single act of compassion had cascaded into something that defied explanation. I accept, he said, on one condition. Any animal that chooses to leave does so freely. No forced retention, no punishment for horses that don't want to be here. Thornton smiled, the first genuine warmth John had seen from the man. Agreed. In fact, I'll extend that to any of the other ranchers' horses as well. Gentlemen, if your animals want to return home with you, they're welcome to go. But if any choose to stay here, I'll pay you fair market value and they'll have a home on Broken Arrow for the rest of their lives. Over the next several hours, an extraordinary sorting took place. Some horses immediately went to their owners, clearly ready to return home. Others lingered, seeming to assess their options, and a significant number, nearly 70 animals, chose to remain with the herd following the stallion that had led them here. As the visiting ranchers departed with their horses, several stopped to shake John's hand. Douglas from Riverside Ranch pulled him aside. My daughter's been after me to treat our horses with more respect, more kindness. After seeing this, I'm inclined to listen to her. You've started something here, Stewart, something bigger than any of us realized was possible. By evening, Broken Arrow Ranch had settled into an uneasy new normal. Dalton had departed, cursing and threatening legal action that everyone knew would come to nothing. The remaining ranch hands, seeing which way the wind was blowing, pledged their cooperation to John's new methods. John stood in the main stable, checking on the horses that had chosen to stay. The stallion followed him like a shadow, never more than a few steps away. When When John reached the stall where he'd first treated the horse's injured leg, the animal stopped and looked at him with those intelligent dark eyes. "I don't understand what happened," John said quietly. "How you healed so fast, how you gathered all those horses, how you knew to bring them here. Part of me thinks I'm still frozen in that cave, hallucinating all of this." The stallion lowered its head, allowing John to run his hand along its neck. The horse's coat was warm and alive under his palm, as real as anything he'd ever touched. And in that moment John realized that understanding wasn't required. Some mysteries couldn't be explained. Some bonds transcended logic. What mattered was that he'd made a choice to show mercy when it was difficult. And somehow, that choice had rippled outward, touching the lives of animals and humans across the territory. The stallion had returned with an army, not to wage war, but to demonstrate what loyalty looked like when it was earned through kindness rather than demanded through dominance. Thornton found John in the stable as the last light of day faded. The ranch owner carried 2 tin cups and a bottle of whiskey. He poured generous measures and handed one to John. "To the damnedest thing I've ever seen," Thornton said, raising his cup. John touched his cup too. Thornton's to second chances. They drank in comfortable silence, listening to the sounds of horses settling in for the night, the sounds of contentment, safety, rest, the sounds of animals that knew they were valued. "I built this ranch on the principle that success comes from working harder than everyone else," Thornton said eventually, pushing every resource to its limit, maximizing efficiency, eliminating waste, and I was successful by those measures, but I think I forgot something important along the way. "What's that?" John asked. "That just because something can be measured doesn't mean it's the only thing worth measuring. Dalton ran our horse operation by the numbers, feed costs, productivity rates, replacement schedules, everything had a calculation attached, but he never factored in things like trust, respect, or loyalty. Turns out those might be the most valuable commodities of all." John thought about the stallion standing quietly beside him, about the army of horses that had gathered in response to a single act of compassion. "I think you're right, sir." Over the following weeks, word of what happened at Broken Arrow Ranch spread across Wyoming and beyond. Some dismissed it as tall tales and exaggeration. Others claimed it was proof of forces beyond human understanding. But among ranchers and horse handlers, the story took on a different significance. Methods began to change. More care was taken with injured animals. More patience was shown with difficult horses. The harsh efficiency that had characterized Western ranching started to soften just slightly as men remembered that the animals they worked with were more than tools or property. John Stewart became something of a legend, though he never sought the attention. He ran Broken Arrow's horse operation with quiet competence, and under his management, the ranch's reputation for quality stock grew exponentially. Horses that had been written off as troublesome or untrainable seemed to thrive under his care. The stallion that started it all lived on the ranch for another 23 years, never showing any lasting effects from its near-fatal injury. The horse sired dozens of colts, each inheriting something of their father's exceptional nature, and whenever John walked through the pastures, the old stallion would always come to greet him, a living reminder of the day a man's choice to show mercy changed the course of many lives. Years later, when John was asked to explain what had happened that winter day in 1907, he would simply smile and say that horses understood loyalty better than most humans. They knew the difference between someone who saw them as property and someone who saw them as partners, and when given the chance, they chose to stand with those who had stood up for them. It wasn't magic, he would say. It wasn't supernatural intervention or mass hallucination. It was simply the natural response of intelligent emotional creatures to an act of genuine compassion in a world that too often valued profit over life. But late at night, when he was alone in the stables, John would sometimes catch the old stallion watching him with those dark knowing eyes, and he would wonder if perhaps there was more to the story than he could ever fully understand. Some bonds he had learned transcended explanation. Some debts could only be paid in ways that defied human logic. And sometimes when the wind blew just right across the Wyoming plains, John could swear he heard echoes of that impossible chorus. 200 horses speaking in one voice, telling a story of loyalty that would outlive them all. If this story of loyalty and redemption touched your heart, please consider subscribing to our channel for more incredible tales about horses. Your support through likes, comments, and shares helps us continue bringing these powerful stories to life. Hit that notification bell so you never miss when we upload our next story of courage, justice, and the unbreakable bonds between humans and horses. Click the video appearing on your screen now to discover another remarkable story about horses that will restore your faith in the power of compassion.